Revelation chapter 16. I'm going to take a look at verse 16. 16:16. It simply has to do with the plagues, and it mentions, and they gathered them together in the place which in the Hebrew is called Armageddon, or Armageddon. And I titled today's presentation On the Brink of Armageddon, and actually this is about as much as we're going to talk about Armageddon. But Armageddon is succinct in that it's the consummation of everything in the book of Revelation. It's when Jesus shows up. Some people think Armageddon is a battle that we fight with tanks and guns and stuff, and it's not. Armageddon is the final showdown between Michael and Lucifer, between Christ and Satan, that we see in Revelation chapter 12, the great controversy theme, the battle in heaven. The final showdown, Jesus shows up. This is the Mount Carmel experience. When Elijah asked, who's God? We're going to find out who God is today. Well, we find out who God is when Jesus shows up. And that's the finishing. And so what we're going to talk about are things that are going to lead us to the consummation, because we're on the brink of that right now. And unlike Karl camping, it wasn't last Sabbath, but it is soon. We know we are in the last days. Is when I was here the last time, we talked about how we were sure that we had a message. Who told you to run? We know through looking at the prophecies of Daniel 7, 8, and 9 that places us in time. That this is a movement called with a message. We were founded in place and time. We were founded on prophecy, a prophetic people. And we know that the time is right now, that the time is proper for us to go with this message. And so we are sure with that. And of course, we talked about the message last month. The main thing we talked about was the contrast between those two chapters. Chapter 13, the beast system. Chapter 14, the 144,000 with the message of the three angels. We saw the whole world following after the beast system. And our message is to call them to follow after Creator God. And we talked about how that was the gospel in verity. And our movement, as I said, was founded in prophecy through the fulfillment of that in Daniel chapter 7, 8, and 9, the 2,300 days that we see recorded in Daniel 8. And it culminated with the organization of the church in 63, and we're still with it here in 2011, to give the final message. The three angels' messages actually have more importance here than here. Too often we see the three angels' messages as something that we learned in the past, and it belongs somewhere back of us. It's not. It's an end-time message, and it belongs with us in the end time. Wherever we are down here, it's more timely. And as each day passes, it becomes even more timely. Three angels' messages is a relevant message today, and we need to understand it today, in today's context. We see that the three angels' messages were called the gospel and verity. Remember what that meant? Gospel and verity means what? Gospel and actuality. The three angels' messages don't go with the gospel. They're not like the gospel. They don't go parallel with it. They are, in fact, the gospel. We are to proclaim the gospel in the end days. Now, that sounds kind of confusing to some older Adventists, because we're used to interpreting things a certain way, and we say, well, the second angel and the third angel means this, and we don't see the gospel. And we explained that a month ago, how the gospel is found in each angel. And as it goes. And each angel, though, starts at a different time, they all go together at the end. And they all have to be given in their order. You can't give someone this message unless they have this message. Everything's given in its order. And we see that the first angel's message is the essential message unpacked, which has to do with salvation. Remember, we're given the everlasting gospel in the context of judgment is. Calling people to worship Creator God. And we saw how that was a reflection. John had used language of the past to explain the present and future, and he takes it right from the first table of the law, where it says, God, I am the one. He says, who delivered you from Egypt, salvation. And we see it there in the first table. So the message in itself is no different. It's important for us, though, as we begin to talk about this fourth angel, the angel of Revelation 18, that we understand a little bit of the structure of the book of Revelation. And we have a tendency to read the Bible as it is, and that's a good hermeneutic. And that's just a rule for interpreting Bible prophecy. Hermeneutic that we use is what's called literal. We read it as it is. Now, a lot of evangelicals today read the Bible literally too, but that's actually ultra-literal or called letterist. They're literalist. They read things in such an ultra-literal way that when they get to the 144,000 in chapter 7 of Revelation, they're Israel and they're de facto Israel. Now, we've done some of that. We've got kind of caught up into that. If it's ultra-literal, if it is Israel, then it has to be 144,000. We look at it as 144,000. Some of us look at it literally, 144,000. And if it is literally 144,000, then it has to be literally Jews. Well, we know that doesn't work. So we have to look at it differently. And so the hermeneutic of Revelation is different. You go back to Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. Let's open that. Some Bibles say things a little different according to the translation that you use. And that's why I like to use different translations, because they help to shed a little light on how we understand the Bible. I'm using the New American Standard. And it's in verse 1, actually. And mine says that the bondservant, the things which must shortly take place, and he sent and communicated it by his angel. Does anybody have a different word than communicated it by his angel? Signified. Okay. Signified is actually a better translation when you look at the original Greek. Signify is actually gave it in symbols. So John's revelation is given in symbols, not in straight literal language. In other words, when you read Revelation, you have to read it symbolically unless or until the context demands a literal reading. Usually when you're reading the Bible, you're reading it literally unless or until something indicates that it has to be read symbolically or something. But Revelation's the opposite. You got that? It was given to him in symbols. Everything's symbolic. And so you have to use that hermeneutic. John sets the stage. We didn't make anything up. He tells us how we have to look. There's another hermeneutic, a rule or structure that we want to look at, and it's how the book is written. When we usually read books, we read the climax toward the end and we have an epilogue. In this case, the climax is in the middle. And we find that structure used a lot in the Bible. The structure gives us the climax in the middle and then goes on to expound upon it. And that's called a chiastic structure. And the reason why is when I use here John, out of John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, He was in the beginning with God. This is a chiasm because to us this is an X, but in the Greek language that's the letter chi. So it forms the structure, whereas these two center parts have connections in thought, and the front and end section have a connection in thought, so it creates that X pattern, that chiastic structure. Well, a more complicated or formal chiastic structure would probably look something like this. It usually is dressed because there's more points to be paralleled. And in the book of Revelation, what we see in the beginning, you have your prologue, your epilogue, and then you have dealing with the seven churches. Remember the letter to the seven churches. Followed by the seven seals, the seven trumpets. And then you have your center chapters. Your center chapters deal with the total structure and the issues that are in the book. The issues of the great controversy theme. The issue of the beast system in chapter 13. The issues of the 144,000 giving the last day message. And the issues of the consummation, Jesus coming with the sickle in his hand. He's wearing the wreath, not the diadem, the wreath. The wreath of victory for like the Grecian Olympic races. When they would win, they would give a wreath that they would wear. That's what they would win. And Jesus, who wore a throne of crowns, is now wearing a wreath of victory as he comes with the sickle. And so in the center part, we see all the issues. And the issues primarily deal with worship. Who are you going to worship? That brings us back to Elijah again on Mount Carmel, asking the question, who are you going to worship? But then it follows afterwards that these chapters begin to expound upon this center portion. And it's in contrast to here. The 7 trumpets were punishments poured out by God, tempered with mercy. Not everything was destroyed. You still had a chance. But here, contrast it with the 7 bowls or the 7 plagues. Those were poured out without mixture. No mercy. And so they contrast to each other. Here's the 7 seals, which is in the unfolding of the church in history from the time or the ascension of Christ until the consummation. This is the church on earth, the church militant, as it goes through and finds victory in Jesus. Here's the millennium. Here's the reward in heaven for the 1,000 years, the church in heaven, the church victorious. In the beginning, we have the 7 churches, the letters to literal 7 churches. The people of God, the earthly Jerusalem. And here is contrasted with the people of God in the New Jerusalem, or the heavenly Jerusalem. And so John lays his book out in that structure. So it's important for us to kind of see that laid out, so we can kind of make these parallels, because they're all over. And this is the general parallel. This is the general chiastic structure, but there are many more points to be made as you go through. For instance, one that I like to bring out is in the end of the 7 letters, Revelation 3:20. Jesus makes a promise to each church, to him who overcometh, he says. And of course, that's in the present participle. We have a tendency to read to him who overcometh as if it's one who's arrived. He's overcome everything. He's achieved perfection. But it's in the present participle and should be really ing. The promise is to him who is overcoming. I will grant to sit with me in my throne, as I have overcome. That's to complete it. And sit with my Father in his throne. This verse here is a dual directional verse and begins to point us from one scene, the 7 churches, to the next scene in chapters 4 and 5, which is the throne room of heaven. And so we see the people of God who are given a promise to sit with him. We see Jesus sitting with the Father in the throne of heaven there. So that verse looks both ways and brings us through the story or the narrative as it goes through. And we'll see this about 7 times throughout the book of Revelation. Another one we're going to look at a little later is Revelation 12:17. So this is the basic structure that I want us to kind of get a feel for. The main thing we're going to talk about is that 4th angel, the angel of Revelation 18, verse 1 and following, the one who comes down from heaven. But we know that initially we have the 3rd angel's message, which is the sealing. This is the message calling us not to receive the mark, warning us to avoid the mark of the beast, to make sure we're sealed with the Holy Spirit. We talked about that last time. The seal of God is his Holy Spirit upon our life. That's out of Ephesians 1:13 and 4:30. God may use seals or indications of who his are at the end. May use a test of loyalty, and we understand that to be the Sabbath. We talked about that last time. But we're sealed with the Holy Spirit. You're not sealed with a day. We're sealed by the person of the day. Very important to understand. Otherwise, you'll find yourself into essentially legalism, because it'll be conditional, things that you do in order to be saved. And you're going to find yourself woefully lacking. This time period parallels from chapter 13 and then the following in chapter 17. This is the beast from chapter 13. Does anybody, can you see that picture of that beast well enough? Do you realize this is a composite of the beast from Daniel 7? Remember the 4 beasts from Daniel 7? First beast was a what? A lion. And the second beast was a bear. Third beast was a leopard. And the 4th beast was simply terrible. Terrible, nondescript beast. Just a terrible beast. Well, here we have in 13. Had the mouth of a lion, the body of a leopard, feet of the bear, and terrible with 10 horns. So it's a composite beast of 7. There's reprisal at the end. And it's the system at the end we find in chapter 17 of the book of Revelation.